The Consortium of Classical Educators provides resources and regional connections for Christian families, teachers, and educational organizations to expand the reach of classical education and foster human flourishing for generations to come.
Thank you, Tim, and thank you, Laban. I think he stepped out we appreciate Hillsdale and not only their letting us use this facility, but also just what they stand for. And so if you have children or grandchildren looking at college age, that would be a great place to look at. Have students of my own that I've taught in the past that are now Hillsdale undergrads, so it's fun to see that. As Tim mentioned, I am the president of Kepler Education, and we are an online platform that provides, if you would think of it this way, as like an Airbnb for classical Christian education or an Amazon marketplace. Jillian Santoro, who's with us in the back, is one of our teachers, teaches on the platform. And so if you have questions about what it would be like to teach on the platform, Jillian could probably give you the very best insight into that. But we allow our teachers to, with some very loose contours, because we have a large tent for classical education. We are a mere Christian platform. We are broadly classical, and we are Burkean conservative. So those are some terms that we use intentionally to kind of guide the worldview under which Kepler teachers operate. All of our teachers provide a very clear distinction about their teaching philosophy, their statement of faith, and their own bio and credentials and how long they've been teaching, so that parents can select and choose teachers wisely. Teachers, they get to develop their own curriculum. They also get to set their own prices and schedule. And so really, parents who are homeschooling can supplement their homeschool by taking courses a la carte, if that's helpful. Or if somebody is what we sometimes call our public school refugees, they're trying to get out but don't know really what to do, we have a complete diploma track that allows them to continue to homeschool, but we provide the structure and help. We also service private schools that are brick and mortar, that, small up and coming classical Christian schools who need a humanities teacher, but they have 3 high school students. It wouldn't make sense to hire a teacher to do that, and so that we can pipe a teacher into the classroom or set them up in one of our classes. So we offer a lot of services to try to help foster classical education. And that's what this learning, with the consortium, the New England Consortium of Classical Educators, not to be confused with the Classical Learning Consortium for New England, which we were partnering with. We exist to try and foster classical education in a grassroots level in various regions of the country. So we started out in the South, we're in New England, and it looks like next year we'll be moving into adding into the central area as well as Pacific Northwest. So we just continue to, at a grassroots level, try to help foster that. And what I'd like to talk to you today about is what is classical education. And I want to approach this from a standpoint not knowing what you know. So if I say something that seems so very obvious, that's not meant to be belittling in any way. And if I say something that doesn't seem to make sense or is above your understanding, please don't feel intimidated by that. Feel free to ask questions. We'd love to answer them. But I want to talk about what classical education actually is in a very broad sense. And I want to start with one of my favorites, William Goldman's The Princess Bride, right? So if you don't know that, then you might be a little bit lost, but if you do, then you're familiar with Inigo Montoya and Vizzini, right? Vizzini constantly is saying, inconceivable. And finally, Inigo Montoya tells him, you keep using that word, but I don't think you know what it means. And so this is what a lot of people often think of when they think of classical Christian education. And I'm reminded, David Goodwin, in an article in the Classical Difference, illustrates this very thing in an article that he wrote, where he pointed out his first encounter with the confusing expression was like finding a treasure in the mud that needed cleaning off. Goodwin says, my mind locked immediately on an unfortunate image, liberal as opposed to conservative, arts as a euphemism for joblessness, and education, a hoop-jumping, time-passing exercise that consumes the first quarter of your life. So what is a liberal arts education, or sometimes called, in our modern revival of it, classical Christian education? In general, the liberal arts refers to the medieval educational model that's usually comprised of 7, and you might be surprised to discover that in some cases in the medieval period there were 9 liberal arts. And the liberal arts are bifurcated into the trivium, and that's a Latin word that means 3 paths or 3 ways, and the quadrivium, another Latin, same Latin, but it means 4 paths. The trivium consists of grammar, logic, and rhetoric, components that you're probably familiar with. And it was considered the lower or foundational division of a liberal arts education in most expressions. And while the quadrivium consisted of arithmetic or pure number, geometry, which is number in space, and music, number in time, and astronomy. Sometimes music is called harmony also. And astronomy is number in space and time. And that was considered the upper division of learning. But as many, like James Shaw in his book, The Life of the Mind, have both argued and demonstrated, a liberal arts education is much more than an educational structure, although it's not less than one. One way to define a liberal arts education is to analyze the nomenclature itself. The word liberal is derived from the Latin root libere, and it means freely. More specifically, it actually comes from the Latin adjective liberalis, which means freedom. But in both cases, it has the idea of a free citizen, gentlemanly, honorable, generous, liberal, handsome. Those are the spectrum that the word can take on. But as you can see from the etymology of this adjective, a liberal education is the education of a free person. The education that is required for a free society. Dr. Shaw points out aptly that certain disciplines, particularly what is known from Aristotle as metaphysics, are called freeing subjects. Such liberal discipline is undertaken for its own sake. That is, the purpose of the knowledge gained is not to do anything with it. Now think about that for just a moment. It's not job training. It doesn't have an end per se, but rather just to know something is itself a pleasure. In other words, liberal refers to the fact that there is such a kind of knowledge in which humanity, if such humanity is to govern themselves as freemen as opposed to slaves, ought to know for the sheer pleasure of knowing it. Elsewhere, Shaw explains what in essence this knowledge consists of. He says, the liberal arts are not one person's invention, but rather represent the collected wisdom of many generations and nations. We should recognize from the beginning that these freeing or liberal arts are not simply a body of books to read, but a way of life that enables us to be free enough to know the truth of things. Now, we've talked about the word liberal. Let's talk about the word art. The word art is derived from the Greek word techne, and it means craft or trade. The idea of an art in this sense might best be described as the tools and skills free people need to create meaningful and purposeful lives. As David Goodwin notes in that same article, 200 years ago, art was simply anything created by a human for a purpose. Very useful and beautiful stuff. But the specific category of liberal arts then and now speaks of the set of tools used by free men to lead and live wisely. Of course, in modern conversations, the usefulness of art is a hotly debated topic, but that's a discussion for another time. Finally, there is the word education, and that might be just the most misunderstood of all the terms that we are going to be talking about. Education, as I mentioned a moment ago, is often associated with job training. People think about getting their education, they're thinking about a career, they're thinking about something that they can learn to do with their life. And the word education, as Shaw points out, is not a thing. The word educare means to bring forth or to complete something that has already begun by the very fact that one is a human being. So an education is to bring a human being who's in their immature state until their full human flourishing state. It could be said that education is the cultivation of wisdom and virtue within a person, the enlarging of one's soul and intellect. But one thing an education is not is job training. Job training is job training. Education is an educare. So, in Platonic terms, we might think of an education as to be one who is delivered from the cave of images where the true light of the sun illuminates what is real. Additionally, to be educated is to know and to be able to articulate truth. But, as Shaw points out, it's not only to know what the truth is, and not only to be able to articulate what the truth is, but also to be able to explain the false views, and to know what it is to be unintelligent and vicious. This is, Shaw explains, a considerable part of being intelligent and virtue. Not only to know what the truth is, what virtue is, but to also know what the false is and what it looks like to be vicious, to know both sides. In some, the expression liberal arts education isn't inconceivable, as Vicini would think, neither in concept nor in possibility, but as the ancients duly noted, it can be painful, and not everyone will be inclined to pursue one, especially those who think it means something that it doesn't mean. So without further qualification, I want to continue in describing what is this classical education, or what is a liberal arts education. And I want to do so from the presupposition that, generally speaking, the modern classical Christian education is the recovery of the ancient liberal arts tradition as it was animated by Christianity, by the biblical view of creation, the natural order of the cosmos, and by the gospel of Jesus, that is, the incarnation, death, burial, and resurrection of Christ. And I'm going to unpack a little bit more of this later on tomorrow and deal with a few more things. But I do want to give an example that I think is worth noting that would be helpful in this situation. And since the liberal arts tradition arguably reached their zenith in the Middle Ages, it might be insightful to turn one of the most influential educators of that period for this example. In 1159, a fellow by the name of John of Salisbury, who was the secretary and counselor to Thomas Becket. Any history teachers? So we know the famous Thomas Becket, the renowned Archbishop of Canterbury, who lost his head to Henry II, or as Henry would say, to some very overzealous knights who overheard him in a drunken rage. But in any case, his secretary, John of Salisbury, published an influential treatise on education called the Metalogicon. And the title literally means about logic, meta and logia. So drawing heavily from the works of classical antiquity along with patristic and medieval Christian writers, Metalogicon is said to be the cardinal treatise of medieval pedagogy, a classic in the history of educational theory, and a landmark in several fields of learning, including philosophy, theology, psychology, and education. In this cardinal treatise, John begins laying the foundation for a liberal arts education by advocating for a harmonized education on the grounds that the universe is intelligently created and ordered by a triune God. He writes, "The creative Trinity, the one true God, has so arranged the parts of the universe that each requires the help of the others, and they mutually compensate for their respective deficiencies, all things being members one of another. He goes on and says that the universe God created is one that has various working parts, each with its own purpose and function, so arranged to be mutually dependent on the help of the other parts where it's deficient, and offering its strengths in the areas where it is more competent in function. And this understanding of the cosmology echoes the ancient understanding of the human soul, particularly the Platonic vision, that is, virtuous when the noetic, spirited, and appetitive natures are all working together in harmony according to their respective strengths. The noetic nature, if you think of the head, just as a physical illustration, the noetic nature is where wisdom resides. But as the ancients found out and discovered, the cerebral logic is very weak at the task of accomplishing what it ought to accomplish. How many of us have seen that second piece of chocolate cake and we know that we shouldn't probably have that, but yet we think, it sure looks good, right? So the cerebral knows what it ought to do, but we find that we don't often do that. The appetitive nature, this is because the appetitive nature, or the passions where we feel and where we desire, are much stronger than the noetic nature, and they tend to overpower reason. The spirited nature, where discipline and courage resides, is the strongest of all, and it must be employed to keep the passions in check with wisdom. Or to put it in C.S. Lewis's words, the head must rule the belly through the chest. A harmonized education, then, is an education that cultivates the soul according to its natural order, where the proclivities of its various natures reflect the created order, where each of the parts are members one of another, functioning in a complementary role. John provides an example of this when defending the necessity of cultivating eloquence in those with a natural proclivity for speaking. He says, just as natural ability easily deteriorates when neglected, so it is strengthened by cultivation and care. The terms cultivation and care reflect on the vocation of husbandry, where germination of plant life is natural, but with the help of a husbandman, tilling, watering, fertilizing, weeding, the plant yields a more bountiful crop. So it is when sound instruction and the practice of an art is so ordered that it works in harmony with the natural inclinations and proclivities. It yields more abundance of knowledge and understanding, and in turn, an abundance of virtue and wisdom. Now, John explains it this way. Natural ability is an eminent power infused in one's soul by nature. And the word eminent that I'm using here, or that he uses, is not imminent like immediately, but imminent in terms of form or structure. Okay? And so the importance, he says, although it proceeds from nature, it's fostered by study and exercise, the importance of an approach that cultivates the soul in harmony with a created order is so fundamental to John's understanding of education, he boldly asserts that whoever tries to thrust asunder what God has joined together for the common good should rightly be adjudged a public enemy. And I would like to just let that sink in for a moment, to think about the strength of that statement. To any educator who would attempt to educate otherwise than according to the cosmic order, the universal order, the order of the soul, as it would all function in relation to each other, he said anyone who would attempt to educate otherwise should be considered a public enemy. That's strong language. Interestingly, he asserts that the kind of education that harmoniously reflects the created order and has set as its object to effect man's liberation, so that freedom from cares he may devote himself to wisdom, is called the liberal arts. It's a contemplative kind of education. In the modern world, Robert Hutchins rightly recognized that the aim of a liberal education is human excellence, both private and public, for a man is, as he notes, a political animal. Its object is the excellence of man and man as citizen. It regards man as an end, not as a means, and it regards the ends of life and not the means to it. It is for this reason it is the education of free men. Other types of education or training treat men as some means to another end, or are at best concerned with the means of life, with earning a living, and not with its ends. The substance of liberal education appears to consist in the recognition of basic problems, in knowledge of distinctions and interrelations in subject matter, and in comprehension of ideas. In other words, in a liberal education, a free education, the human person is able to think integratedly. They think about not different subject matter necessarily, but how all those subject matters interrelate to one another. Liberal education seeks to clarify the basic problems and to understand the way in which one problem bears upon another. It strives for a grasp of the methods by which solutions can be reached and the formulation of standards for testing solutions proposed. The liberally educated man, and I want to qualify here, I've used this in Latin, there's a difference between homonym and vir, and here we're talking about homonym or anthropos, mankind, okay? So this is just to make that clarification, something that I want to be sure I clarify. Liberal education seeks to clarify these basic problems, and the liberally educated man understands, for example, the relation between the problem of the immortality of the soul and the problem of the best form of government. He understands that one problem cannot be solved by the same method as the other, and that the test that he'll have to bring to bear upon solutions proposed differs from one problem to another. In other words, not all assessments are created equal, right? The liberally educated man understands, by understanding the distinctions and interrelations of the basic fields of subject matter, the differences and connections between poetry and history, between science and philosophy, between theoretical and practical sciences. He understands the same methods cannot be applied to all these fields, and he knows the methods which are appropriate to each. The liberally educated man comprehends the ideas that are relevant to the basic problems and that operate in the basic fields of subject matter. He knows what is meant by soul, state, God, beauty, and by the other terms that are basic to the discussion of fundamental issues. He has some notion of the insights that these, singly or in combination, provide concerning human experience. The liberally educated man has a mind that can operate well in all fields. He may be a specialist in one field, but he can understand anything important that is said in any field and can see and use the light that it sheds upon his own. The liberally educated man is at home in the world of ideas and in the world of practical affairs too, because he understands the relation of the two. He may not be at home in the world of practical affairs in the sense of liking the life he finds about him. That may be the case, but he will be at home in the world in the sense that he understands it. He may even derive from his liberal education some conception of the difference between a bad world and a good one, and some notion of the ways in which one, the bad, might be turned into the other, the good. The method of liberal education is the liberal arts, and the result of liberal education is discipline in those arts. The liberal artist learns to read, write, speak, listen, understand, and think. He learns to reckon, measure, and manipulate matter, quantity, and motion in order to predict, produce, and exchange. And as we live in the tradition, whether we know it or not, so we are all liberal artists, whether we know it or not. We all practice the liberal arts, well or badly, all the time, every day. And we should understand the tradition as well as we can in order to understand ourselves, so that we should be as good liberal artists as we can in order to become as fully human as we can be. As Robert Hutchins asserted, the liberal arts are not merely indispensable, they're unavoidable. Nobody can decide for himself whether he's going to be a human being. The only question open to him is whether he's going to be an ignorant, undeveloped one, or one who has sought to reach the highest point he's capable of attaining. The question, in short, is whether he'll be a poor liberal artist or a good one. Now, as we've unpacked what liberal arts look like, unpacked what liberal arts do, how they might be distinct from that kind of education, which is called job training, I want to give just briefly here 7 characteristics of a classical education. How do we know, by looking at these 7 characteristics, how do we know what a classical education looks like? And I want to wrap up this talk by simply identifying these 7 characteristics. And the reason I put it in terms of characteristics is so that we can look at this not from any particular angle of one classical tradition over another, but to look at a broad way in which all traditions or all microcosms share. So first, what we call the classical education has looked differently in epochs of history. So depending on who's answering the question, what is a classical education, one might get a slightly different answer. If they're focusing on pre-Christian classical education, or classical education as it functioned during the scholastic period, the Renaissance period, the modern period of classical Christian renewal that began in the early 1980s, or in what some are now calling Christian classical education. And each of these are some variation of that classical education. Now, the second reason that there are likely as many micro-persuasions as there are eyes on Argos is that during the modern age of recovering classical Christian education, educators have continued to grow in their understanding of what classical Christian education is. For example, in a great book, if you haven't read The Liberal Arts Tradition, written by Ravi Jain and Kevin Clark, they suggest there are 4 periods of growth in the classical Christian education movement. And that's a book I would highly recommend if you're wanting to learn a little bit more about this kind of education. And then finally, there's a third reason why it's sometimes difficult to nail down one particular answer of what it is. And that third reason is directly related to the first 2. As understanding has grown about what classical Christian education has been and how it was implemented in ages past, so have opinions about which historical expression is most important to recover in the modern world. And this tends to be a problem in anything that is seeking recovery, right? We find different expressions at different time periods and think, well, this is the best, or this is the best. For example, do students in the modern world still need to study Latin to be classically educated? Wouldn't studying modern languages do just as well? Also, where does the study of the subsidiary sciences like biology and ecology fit into classical Christian education? So these are questions that have to be answered, and questions that are sometimes hotly debated among classical educators. In a nutshell, while classical Christian education is a historic tradition of education that stands in opposition to the modern progressivist pedagogy and agenda, we must recognize the tradition is mildly dynamic, developing over more than 2 millennia of Western civilization, and a truly classical Christian education is one that strives to glean the best of Western liberal education in every epoch. So, how do we define it? Well, the Association of Classical Christian Schools provides one of the most concise definitions, saying that classical Christian education is a time-tested educational system which establishes a biblical worldview called paideia, incorporates methods based on natural phases of student development, cultivates the 7 Christian virtues, trains student reasoning through the trivium, grammar, logic, and rhetoric, and interacts with the historical great books. On the other hand, the website Well-Trained Mind gives a far more expansive definition and then summarizes, saying that a classical education then has 2 important aspects. It is language-focused, and it follows a specific 3-part pattern. The mind must be first supplied with facts and images, that's grammar, then given the logical tools for organization of facts, logic or dialectic, and finally equipped to express conclusions, or what we call rhetoric. And while these definitions are both accurate and sound as far as they go, neither mention an essential aspect of classical Christian education, which is the quadrivium, the second part of the 7 liberal arts. The second half, what is accurately mentioned, however, still requires some unpacking to more fully answer the question, what is the classical Christian education? So here's the first characteristic that I would suggest. First, the classical Christian education is the development and cultivation of paideia. Now, paideia is an interesting word whose etymology can be recognized in words like pediatrics or pedagogy. In his letter to the saints at Ephesus, St. Paul writes this: "Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord." Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 4. The word translated discipline here is the Greek word paideia, and it's defined as the act of providing guidance for responsible living, upbringing, training, instruction, chiefly as it is attained by discipline and correction. It is a word that's related to the word translated discipline in this verse, which is nouthesia, meaning counsel about avoidance or cessation of an improper course of conduct or admonition. The definitions are noted here to draw attention not only to the denotation of paideia, but also to its connotations. It reveals the fundamental nature of education, the rearing of a young person in a proper view of the world, that is, a worldview that guides the way he should go, Proverbs 22:6. Now, what's interesting is that while the word worldview brings its own set of baggage to the conversation, it is used here to mean thinking Christianly about the world in which we live and move and have our being. A young person with a Christian worldview possesses a comprehensive vision of the cosmos as having been created and still being redeemed by God. He or she also possesses a moral imagination informed by, first, the truth of Scripture, but also by the noble traditions of the church. The idea of Christian worldview falls into the stage of education called piety. We'll look at that in just a moment. Now, one quick note before we look at the 2nd through 7th characteristic, and that is this. The word paideia would have been a very well-known word to the ancients in the classical tradition. Anyone who was going to be a citizen, first of Athens and later of Rome, had to have paideia. Paideia was the kind of education that made you a good citizen. So it's a word that was tossed around a lot. And what I'm suggesting is that the Apostle Paul did not, he wasn't parsing words. He was using a word that they would have all been very familiar with. This wasn't a new concept, but he makes gives a prepositional phrase that gives placement to the kind of citizen that he's talking about. It's the nurture and admonition, or paideia, of the Lord. So raising children, paideia, from a classical Christian worldview, isn't necessarily raising a child to first be a citizen of the state, although that is true, but to be a citizen of the kingdom of heaven. That's one of the most important distinctions that is made there. And by nature, by virtue of that, you'll also be a good citizen of the state. The second characteristic of a classical Christian education is its focus on a liberal or humane education, that we unpacked at the beginning of this talk. In opposition to the modern and slavish approach to training mere workers for an industrialized, institutionalized, crony capitalist society, classical Christian education seeks to educate the whole person, human qua human. Recall, this is what libere in the liberal arts refers to. A classical Christian education is the education of a liberated man, or the education that makes for a full and free human being. Interestingly, John Gardner, in a book called Excellence, a book that's out of print now, noted that we don't even know what skills may be needed in the years ahead. He says, that is why we must train our young people in the fundamental fields of knowledge and equip them to understand and cope with change. This is why we must give them the critical qualities of mind and durable qualities of character that will serve them in circumstances we cannot now even predict. I find this statement fascinating. This was written at the end of the 19th century. And I find this fascinating because from about 1890 to 1920 was the big struggle over education, where we start with Horace Mann and end with John Dewey, and this change in our direction of education. And he's calling for a kind of education that says, we don't know what the future is going to look like. Technical skills aren't where they need to be educated. It's in the human skills. In the last decade, or I'm not sure how long Steve Jobs has been gone now, but Steve Jobs, Mark Cuban, and Elon Musk, all tech giants of their time, all said in interviews, you can probably find them on YouTube somewhere, that when asked what should a young person be studying, what tech should they get involved in, they all said none of those, the liberal arts. If they want to be human beings in the modern age and the postmodern age, then they've got to study the liberal arts. That's what we need. So it's interesting that they point to that, people who are as influential as they are in the modern world. The third characteristic of a classical Christian education is the pedagogical method that follows the order of the medieval 7 liberal arts, mainly as it relates to the child's development, but also as an approach to teaching all subject matter. We've already discussed the 7 liberal arts as described by the medieval divines in the trivium, the 3 ways, and the quadrivium, or 4 ways. First, following the trivium, students learn grammar, that's the language, the nuts and bolts of a thing, then the dialectic or logic, and finally rhetoric, how to express oneself accurately and persuasively, before moving on to study the quadrivium. The quadrivium treats 4 universal truths: number, geometry, harmony, and astronomy, just giving those back as we talked about them a moment ago. Now, early in the modern renewal of classical Christian education, those seeking to recover the classical model of education relied on an essay by Dorothy Sayers. Many of you probably are familiar with The Lost Tools of Learning. It was an extremely helpful essay, and many schools adopted her pedagogical model, but the recovery didn't stop there. In the midst of repairing the ruins, more about classical pedagogy was discovered, and to lean on a tired trope, Sayers' pedagogical insights were just the tip of the iceberg. Recovery of classical pedagogy also revealed just how important poetic knowledge was to the formation of the whole human person. And today, most recognize a much fuller expression of classical Christian education than which was first laid out by Ms. Sayers. Clark and Jane, for example, give the PG MAPT paradigm. Now that's a big, long expression that just simply points to piety, gymnasium, music, liberal arts, philosophy, and theology, that all of those would be part of a classical Christian education, where A in their little paradigm stands for liberal arts. Okay, the fourth characteristic recognizes the pedagogical approach must be applied to something. So we can't just have grammar, logic, rhetoric applied to nothing. It has to be applied to something, and that something it's more than a pedagogy, in other words. And that something is a specific pool of knowledge, the best of what has been thought and written in the last 2.5 millennia of the Western tradition. Sometimes this pool of knowledge is called the Western canon, or sometimes referred to as the great books. And when we hear that, sometimes we think of Mortimer Adler's 60-volume set published by the University of Chicago and the Encyclopedia Britannica, but his are merely a collection of the kinds of works to which the great books refer. While it's a good collection, it's also an incomplete collection. And the president of Harvard College, Charles Eliot, suggested his own list of similar books, which were affectionately come to be called the 5-foot shelf. Maybe you've heard that term, and published as the Harvard Classics. But in a nutshell, classical Christian education makes a point of exposing students to these primary sources in an integrated fashion, finding in both the classical and Christian traditions that all truth, that is, all approximation to reality, is part of a whole. In other words, knowledge of any subject is only partial knowledge of the one true, complete truth. Instead of studying textbooks of disintegrated subjects like social studies, history, or English, in a classical Christian education, students typically study the humanities in an integrated fashion. If you study history, you're also going to read the literature of that history, and you're going to read the poetry, or the magic literature and the poetry, and you're also going to read maybe the theology of that period and a variety of things that go with it. The philosophy of the period. The fifth characteristic of a classical Christian education is the study of classical languages. I mentioned earlier in the original kind of question about modern classical education, do students need classical languages to get a classical education? I'm going to argue yes. While a few have made a somewhat meritorious argument of substituting Latin with modern languages, there are many stronger arguments. I keep kicking that box, sorry. Many stronger arguments for the continued inclusion of classical languages like Latin and Greek. And I'll just give you a few. Learning Latin gives students the ability to read many important primary sources in their original tongue. Many of which, by the way, we may not be aware, many Latin sources, particularly coming up into the Reformation, have not ever been translated into English. There's a lot of great important resources that are still in Latin. And so reading Latin will allow a student, learning Latin will allow them to read those texts. Learning Latin provides students with a fuller understanding of the English language, since about 40% of English is derived from Latin. English is an Anglo-Saxon language filtered heavily through the sieve of Latin. Learning Latin will allow students to understand many of the professional vocations that still do and probably always will rely on the Latin language: law, science, medicine, theology. And one ancillary and pragmatic reason is that students who study Latin overwhelmingly score higher on standardized tests than students who have not studied Latin. So if that's important to a person, then that's another good reason. In any case, classical Christian education emphasizes the learning of not only modern languages, but the classical languages as a fundamental staple of a person's education. The sixth characteristic is teaching students with the goal of fostering virtue and wisdom instead of helping them merely accumulate disconnected facts or skills for the job market. While modern education takes what it claims to be a secular approach, they wrongly believe that education can only consist of the is and not the ought. Modern education, it says secular, what they mean is we're not going to have any worldview influence. But that's like standing on no feet, okay? You can put your weight on your left foot, you can put your weight on your right foot, you can try to distribute it evenly, but no one can stand on no feet. Every education has a presupposition, a worldview that backs it up. David Hicks in Norms and Nobility talks about the tyranny of the ideal image. The ideal image is exemplified by the 7 Christian virtues: prudence, fortitude, wisdom, justice, faith, hope, and love, and also revealed in the person of Jesus Christ, Ephesians 4:11 through 16. So a classical Christian education, the 6 characteristics, is its goal and aim is virtue and wisdom over skills in job training or something like that. The 7th and final characteristic has already been alluded to in relation to at least 2 other characteristics, namely in that students read primary sources and classical languages are essential. However, it would be remiss not to emphasize the fact that classical Christian education is language-focused rather than image-focused learning. Now, this does not mean classical Christian education excludes the plastic arts, painting, sculpting, etc. Quite the contrary. It simply means it emphasizes language-based learning. In other words, classical Christian education emphasizes learning through words written and spoken rather than through mere videos or other types of imaging. And I want to close with this short excerpt from Dorothy Sayers' essay that I mentioned earlier, The Lost Tools of Learning, because I think it's apropos not just for the 7th characteristic, but for all of classical education. And here she says this: by teaching them all to read, she's talking about the democracy or democratization of education. By teaching them all to read, we have left them at the mercy of the printed word. I want you to just imagine for a moment what we've done. When we say we want all students to be able to read, all students to be literate, what does that mean? That means we've now set them up to be exposed to words. Words not just that you as the parent or you as the teacher who love and care for them are presenting, but words that anybody wants to give them, right? So she's saying we've left them at the mercy of the printed word. By the invention of the film and the radio, we've made certain that no aversion to reading shall secure them from the incessant battery of words, words, words. They do not know what the words mean. They do not know how to ward them off or blunt their edge or fling them back. They are prey to words in their emotions instead of being masters of them in their intellects. We who were scandalized in 1940 when men were sent to fight armored tanks with rifles are not scandalized when young men and women are sent into the world to fight masked propaganda with a smattering of subjects. And when whole classes and whole nations become hypnotized by the arts of the spellbinder, we have the impudence to be astonished. We dole out lip service to the importance of education, lip service and just occasionally a little grant of money. We postpone the school, leaving age, and plan to build bigger and better schools. The teachers slave conscientiously in and out of school hours, and yet, as I believe, all this devoted effort is largely frustrated because we have lost the tools of learning, and in their absence can only make a botched and piecemeal job of it. Thank you for your time.